And it is something that maybe you need to think about, maybe you don't. Religion, which kind of fits into this category, I think is another thing of that. There's certain characters who it's very important to have religion for some, and how it reacts and things. The Dresden Files make a very big point of having Harry Dresden understanding that religion is real, and it's sort of a thing that happens to other people, but it doesn't necessarily affect him. But over the course of the, at this point, 16 books, his opinion on religion changes to be not so much, it's something that happens to other people as to, okay, it happens to me, I don't like the way it works, and I wish it worked differently, and I'm going to argue with every person who's attached to it, including a guardian angel, because I don't think he's doing his job right. But that's Harry's point, but then you get the other point of his friend Michael, who is a knight chosen by God to go into the, literally chosen by God, the Archangel Michael, given a sword, told, go fight evil. And you have the two of them combating with each other, where they have a way of looking at the world where Michael's like, no, God's gonna take care of it, we're gonna be fine. And Harry's like, I just don't think that's right. And even though you can have that, you can have those moments where people are going to be upset about that. You can have that conversation, that debate. Other books where I think religion comes into it, and then you don't even have, and that's just using Christianity, that's using real world religions. You can create a religion. God knows George Lucas did. The Force is nothing if not a religion. And it's a massively followed one in a bizarre number of ways.
Well,
but
the Game of Thrones, which isn't mostly cousin Stuping, it's more discussions about politics and religion than anything else. There are at least 5 religions that are mentioned, and 3 of them are actually very important to a lot of characters.
Exactly. So you have those things in there. And then you can just use religion as an overlay. C.S. Lewis's Narnia books are all allegories for Christian parables. Aslan the Lion is very clearly an allegory for Jesus, up to and including dying and coming back in the very first book. Because he died for somebody else, so he's allowed to come back for it. And that's, you know, that is, if that ain't the story of Jesus, I'm not really sure what is.
Do you think it matters, because we read that, our 5th graders read that book,
Yeah.
and they don't get the religious. Do you think it lessens a book if maybe they have something like that we can see as adults that clearly that's his role or what he was talking about, but do you think it's okay if like people don't get the religious aspect of it?
I think, yeah, I think so. I think a lot of books reveal themselves over time. The book Catcher in the Rye is a book where I have talked to people who've read it when they were teenagers and think that Holden Caulfield is the most genius, intelligent person who has ever walked the face of the earth and knows exactly how everything works. And I've talked to that same person and that's what they thought when they were like 16, and then when they're 20 they read the book and go, well, Holden's kind of not sure what's going on, but the world's pretty decent, but he's kind of a little wrong about a couple things. And then when they're, you know, my age in their 40s, you know, like, oh, Holden Caulfield is an idiot.
Are you sure that?
And I was him. And I was exactly that stupid when I was his age. Because Holden Caulfield is your typical 16-year-old who figures, well, I know exactly how everything works and I'm always right. Because that's how 16-year-olds work. But if you read that book at different times in your life, you're going to get something different out of it. And I think Narnia is the same way. I think kids can read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and get a very fun story about these brothers and sisters who go off to have a magical adventure with wild animals and talking creatures and mystical wildlife and a talking magic lion and be fine. And then as adults, as they read it again, they're going to get to see okay, this is an allegory, this is something else, this is something different. This isn't what I thought it was. And I think that is perfectly okay. I think that's absolutely, I almost think that would be the ideal way for somebody to read your book. It's for them to sit there, read through it, and then go back again and go, oh man, I didn't even notice that the first time. You know, or to catch something at the very end and then go, oh, I want to go back and see it again, or read it again because I want to see if it's right. You know, I know that, for example, oh good Lord, I just finished a book, and at the end of it, there's a reveal at the end of it, and I'm like going, oh God, now I want to go back and read it again to see if all the clues are there, if I found all this stuff, if I noticed it. So I think as a reader, that's more preferred. I think as a writer, that's the dream. Like, that somebody finishes your book and wants to go back and go, oh, I want to do this again. I want to see where this goes. I think that that becomes a big part of it. Let's see, what else do I have here? Let's see what I got. Okay, I got language. I think we put that, yeah, we did put that up there. So language is another one. I think language is kind of one of those ones where it's kind of interesting, because there's the big scope of languages, like Jeanette mentioned earlier with science fiction and fantasy, where you have Tolkien, who created Elvish and Orcish, like literally created entire languages for elves, orcs, dwarves, trolls, mountain goats, and whatever else came to mind. And Gene Roddenberry did the exact same thing with Vulcans, Klingons, Romulans, Centaurans, and everything else, that they had their own languages. And that's certainly a big deal of it. But then if you go down to an even smaller level, where like just everybody does it, they don't kind of think about it. J.K. Rowling has her own language. There's a lot of words in Harry Potter that didn't exist before Harry Potter. Muggle, Quidditch. The use of the term pureblood in her stories means somebody whose both their parents were wizards. You know, that's taking a language that exists and shifting it slightly. Dementors is another word that she invented. Those didn't exist before her. If you look at, Amy Heckerling wrote a movie called Clueless, which is filled with slang. It is just wall-to-wall slang language. The first time, I remember seeing this in an interview, the first time she sat down to write the script for Clueless, she went and talked to a bunch of high school students, and she found out what all the new slang all the kids were using. Because she wanted to know, she wanted the slang in her movie to be perfect. And she wrote it. And 6 months later, she finished the first draft, and teenagers were using entirely different slang than they were 6 months ago when she did all her research to find out what slang kids were using. And she said she decided that she had the decision to make, do I rewrite it and get new slang, or which won't be done when we're finished rewriting it, and it won't be the same when we film the movie, and it won't be the same when we do something else. Or do we do what she ultimately did and invent her own slang, which ultimately became real slang in a lot of ways. Mike Myers and Dana Carvey did the same thing with Wayne's World. They very clearly wanted to create their own language because they knew they can't. It's impossible to know what kids are going to be saying next week, much less right now, unless you're paying super attention.
Yeah, well, they learned slang from that Abraham Lincoln. Come on,
Yes.
this is the best slang ever.
Exactly. And then you get some people who will use things that people don't recognize as another language. Hal Needham did Smokey and the Bandit and used actual CB lingo for all of the movie. Like they are constantly saying things that kind of don't make sense. To this day, I don't actually know what it means to be in the rocking chair, despite the fact seeing it on a movie and having somebody go, I'm in a rocking chair right now. I'm like, that's great. I don't know what that means.
Now, Tolkien not only invented language, but he invented writing to go with it.
Right. He
The
actually.
language is caught on, but the writing never did.
There's a lot of like the Elven writings like that exist a lot actually, like especially on certain internet forums. There are people that will use that. Plus, there's also people that have turned a lot of the Elvish languages. There's actually 2 or 3 different styles for writing Elvish. Turned them into fonts for English that I've seen. So they haven't caught on as like, you know, everyone writes that way now. But like if you want to learn Elvish, you learn how to write it.
And sadly, he has not caught on the way Roddenberry has, because Klingon is an official second language that you can take at Harvard, and Elvish is not. It was at one point. It may not still be, but at one point you could take Klingon as a second language at Harvard.
With Tolkien, right, he invented like almost the majority of Elvish himself, and he's actually people don't know this, his job as a scholar of ancient language. That was what he did. And so his language, Elvish, is very complex and really out there. Whereas like Klingon is actually a pretty easy to get language, very easy grammar compared to Elvish, which has some really big, crazy grammar.
Yeah, right. And I'll give you one last example of somebody using language in a story in a way that nobody ever intended or thought possible. Lauren Miracle, as an experiment, wrote an entire novel in text for young adults. It is the story of 3 girls navigating high school and talking to each other on their phones. And it is all of their text messages to one another. And I will be honest, I've never read one because I'm pretty sure I can't. I'm too old. But I am encouraged by the fact that, as unusual as that sounds, it was popular enough as a young adult title that there's a series of them. She's written like 3 or 4 that I know of, and there may be more since the last time I looked. So on the one hand, it seems kind of counterintuitive, like, oh, she's writing a book in text, how does that help anybody? But on the other hand, people are reading them, so if they're reading it, I don't care if they're reading it in text, English, or hieroglyphic. At least they're reading something. Which I think is kind of important.
Well, I wonder how hard it is to kind of change the world to try to pull in younger kids to read, like the young adult, like, I'm just thinking of like the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. I mean, he's obviously trying to pull it in the kids, and he's got the little, it's more the comic kind of setting and stuff like that. And the graphic novels, like comic books of novels, that's becoming very big too.
Yeah.
So I wonder if adding the visual of the world along with the description of it, it's probably, I would guess it would be harder for the writer to do that.
I've never read the write-up for a comic book. I've never seen a comic book script. I would think it would be similar to, I have seen movie scripts and television scripts. I would think it would be very similar to that, where this is what happens. I know that the film Watchmen, when they made the movie, they used the comic book as the storyboards for the film. So I would think that it would be a very similar process. Now, that would be setting out to turn the comic book, to make a comic book. To take a novel and turn it into a comic book, that would be a much more interesting process, I think.
They've done that with some, like Artemis Fowl is one.
Yeah.
They've turned into graphic novels and
I
things
know
like that.
Harry Dresden's, at least the first one has been turned into a graphic novel.
The Elder Saga.
Yeah. So it has happened, and I think in that one, I don't know how much of a challenge it is for the writer as it is for the artist on that instance.
Even with the language, like when you brought up Jana Ivanovich in New Jersey, they have different, like, slang, different words for, different things. And that authenticity is what draws the reader into.
Right, and I think that's kind of very important, is how your characters talk and the things they say to one another are going to have a major effect on the believability of your story. Nobody talks in perfect English. I don't even think the Oxford dictionary guys talk in perfect English, despite the fact that I have seen pictures of them and their uniform includes the 3-piece suit with the bowler hat. And you would assume that if anybody were going to be speaking in perfect English, those guys would be the ones. But I think that becomes sort of an idea of it. And I think, actually bringing Oxford kind of is another thing. The Oxford Dictionary is one of the places where you can really look to see that this is how language evolves. They were the ones that said the word dough is an actual word. D-O-H exclamation point is an actual word because the Oxford English Dictionary says so. I'm saying it rather badly. It would be the Homer Simpson. Last year, Oxford announced that the word of the year, the most used word of 2015, is the smiley face emoji. That is, according to Oxford Dictionary, the word of 2015. Which, considering the other emojis out there, I think I'm going to be happy it was the smiley and they got criticism of that. They did. People were like, oh, how could you do that? And I said, well, like, you know what? It's a word. It's what people use. We're not here to talk about how they make the word or what they do with it. This is a word, people used it. Whether you know, it's no less a word than an English hieroglyphic or a Japanese pictogram. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It throws it into a different perspective when you hear it. Okay, so I have one last thing on the board there, and we're kind of running short on time here for a little bit. So, and it's history and time period, which is interesting since we're running out of one of those. So I think that's kind of an important thing, is where things take place. Science fiction was brought up. Star Trek has to happen in the distant future. It really does. I mean, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter has to happen today, because that's a very important part of the story, is that it's modern day, that they have cars, that they have cell phones, that they have these things that these kids, for the most part, don't use because it's not a part of their world. But then at the same time, it is a threat on the things outside of their world, is a threat to the other people outside of their world. And it's the idea that anybody can go be a wizard. Right now, you can be a wizard if you're 11 and you get now. You get to go be a wizard. Raymond Chandler stories are all 1930s noir, mostly because they were written in the 1930s, but that is a very specific time for those stories. That is a very, the concept of what's going on in those stories is very much akin to, it has to be the 1930s. Stephen King's Stand By Me couldn't take place outside the 1950s, I don't think. The story of 4 boys going on a weekend hike to go find a dead body, and one of them taking their dad's gun because he thinks they might have a problem from the town bully, can't be written today. Or, well, it could be written today, it just can't take place today without having severely different style of meanings. You know, like, the boys in the 1950s took a gun because they might have a trouble with the town bullies, kind of like going, well, you know, boys will be boys. Now it's like, somebody's going to die, call the police. It's a much more present problem now than it was in the 1950s that a 10-year-old took a gun. The other end of that is, with time period, is you can fiddle with it a little bit more, I think. You also want to have the idea that time period is interesting, that it's a look at something in a different light. I said Star Trek. Star Trek very much happens in the future, but it's also very much wagon train. I mean, it is very much the idea of a group of people, you know, wagon train is a group of people traveling to a place where they don't know. It's the last frontier. They're going to go out and find a place to live, and they're going to encounter everything under the sun out there. Star Trek is the same thing, but instead of wagons and horses, they got a spaceship. And that becomes a part of how that works. The other thing I think that becomes interesting with time and history is the more history you give your world, the more things that have happened in the past that lead into what happens now. It gives more immediacy to what's going on. It means your characters or your story is less in a vacuum. We've talked about The Hobbit a lot tonight. The fact that The Hobbit takes place in a world where Sauron has been rampaging for decades, where the One Ring has been lost for 50 years, and when it was around originally, it was this great thing that went horribly, horribly wrong and has corrupted everybody that's touched it, is important, is that they have that story that everybody knows that that place sucks because it has always sucked. We do not want to go into Mordor. And every time anybody goes into Mordor, it doesn't go well. So that becomes a part of the story. It makes what everybody else is doing more important, because everybody who's done what these guys are doing before has failed. And I think that is a kind of a big deal for storytelling, especially with the idea that you need to pay attention to, I think, these things on at least some level, so that you know that this is what's going to happen next. And then the other thing is, and again, the other fun thing about world building is all of these examples have a counter, in that if you change just one thing in a story, you change the story. If you take, for example, If you take the story of 7 samurai warriors in ancient Japan and you move it to the Old West, you go from the 7 samurai to the Magnificent Seven. And if you set it in outer space, you go to Battle Beyond the Stars. How many times has anybody referred to anything as Die Hard, but in a fill in the blank? If you look at Romeo and Juliet, if you take 2 kids from Verona and make them 2 kids in New York in the 1970s who are who one of them's in a gang and one of them's the sister of somebody in a gang, you go from Romeo and Juliet to West Side Story. You change just one small thing in a story and you get a completely different thing in a lot of regards. I've seen Alice in Wonderland translated from a little girl goes to a magical kingdom to an adult girl goes to an amusement park that's filled with drugs and alcohol. And it's the same story, but it's now got this new veneer to it, and it takes on a new life, and it has a new meaning. And I think ultimately that becomes kind of the fun thing about writing is when you pay attention to what you're doing and what goes in each part. We've only got a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
You were talking time travel. I mean, we're talking time travel, because you're talking different histories, different religions, different politics, from one end of the story to the other end of the story.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how do you keep all that straight and make sense of it?
That notes, lots and lots of notes.
I wonder if the rules come into play, because you talked about you can create your own rules, but, you know, like you kind of said, if you go back to the 1950s, there were rules that are different than if you go
And
back to,
language and
you know, the
politics.
1800s, so you're kind of,
Yeah.
I wonder if that would.
And I was thinking
trigger
Dr. No
things.
when I said, you know how he goes all the way back to
Dr. Who, but yeah.
Dr. Who. He goes all the way back to Queen Victoria,
Yeah.
and in that period.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And yeah, and you're certainly right. And I think time travel is something that is in and of itself its own problem. Certainly there are some people who've gone very clearly like, these are the rules. And I think with the rules that come into play, time travel is one of the places where you have to lay your rules down. This is how time travel works. This is what happens when you do it. And this is the things that will function and change. And you really have to pay attention to that. Because if you don't, you go from having something like Quantum Leap or Doctor Who, where the rules are very, this is how time travel works, to where you go to the Terminator series, where this is how time travel works, except in this instance, this is, you know, I once heard somebody say that the rules of time travel in Terminator were taken out very early on and beaten with a baseball bat until